Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on causality and certainty in criminal sentencing. Thank you for joining us today. Let me talk about today's program. Momentarily, I will introduce our webinar team. After that, I'll go into some of the motivation and background for our discussion for our webinar today. We will talk about the disparity in criminal sentencing, federal sentencing guidelines, legislation, and Supreme Court rulings. And this is all just really background for what we will subsequently analyze from data. I think this background is really quite important. So we're not just taking data and crunching away at the numbers, but that we're really trying to understand why we're doing this and how important this can be. So once we get to the data analysis part, there are really two parts of it that are very important, and that is, on the one hand, we will discuss certainty, and we will use information theory for that purpose. And then secondly, we will talk about fairness in sentencing, and causality will be a hugely important topic in this context. The first part about the background, I think, should take about 20 minutes or so. Then the second part, which is really the main part of today's presentation, should be about 40 minutes. But let me now talk about our team. Let me start off with Stacy Blodgett in the middle. She is our customer relations manager. She's joining us from Missouri today. Claire Gora is on the right, Director of Sales. She's still fairly new to our team, and we're very happy that she joined us. She's calling in from Toronto, Ontario today. And finally, myself, my name is Stefan Conradi, and I'm the Managing Partner of Bezier USA. I'm calling in from Nashville, Tennessee. Given today's topic is quite different from what we've discussed before, we have many first-time participants. So let me clarify some terminology, as pretty much every other word I will be using today relates to Bayes. Bezier, that's our company, that's who I work for. Then we have BayesiaLab, that is our product, that's our software, our technology. And then finally, what we're utilizing today is the Bayesian network paradigm as it was invented by Professor Judea Pearl. This is what everything really revolves around today. All right, let me share with you a little bit of background of our company. Bezier was founded in 2001 by two professors in the field of artificial intelligence, Dr. Lionel Jouff and Dr. Paul Monteanu. And they had originally developed this little software tool for their own research purposes, but very quickly it became apparent that many folks were interested in this technology. So they formed a company, named it Bezier, and over the last almost 18 years now, this little utility, this little software tool has evolved into a rather comprehensive platform of software packages. Web applications, desktop softwares, APIs, etc. But today we will only talk about BayesiaLab Professional. That's what you will see in the software demo. Now, given all the things that we'll touch on, we really can't go into a lot of details on many aspects of what we're discussing. So I would encourage you to download a copy of our book. It's available as a free download from our website. You can also buy it on Amazon. It's really become quite a bestseller, and we're now frantically working on a second edition because there are so many new features in BayesiaLab that are not yet covered in the original edition of the book. Now, just a few words about BayesiaLab itself. That's our technology, that's our software. That is what we will use today to encode knowledge, to machine learn knowledge from data, to edit networks, to perform inference, analyze, simulate, etc., all utilizing the Bayesian network paradigm. This is perhaps the most commonly asked question that we get in the context of our webinars. Yes, all the slides you see, the data will be available for download, as well as a recording of the entire event. So you can relive the experience and share it with friends and family. Now, before we go into our main topic, just a quick caveat. This is obviously a very sensitive topic today. And what I don't want to happen is that folks take any numbers that we share today and jump to premature conclusions. So what we're not trying to do is arrive at substantive findings. While we're going to use real data, all effect size estimates are really for illustration purposes only. And really just think of them as fictional for now, because I want to make sure that we don't have we're not policymakers, we're not political activists, we are trying to provide research technology. And so just bear this in mind as you see results, etc. So our topic today deals with criminal sentencing in US federal courts. And the background of this webinar is actually quite disturbing when you look at the statistics, and there are quite a lot of numbers and facts on this slide, but there's really a single statistic that is enough to highlight the concern. If you think about that, the lifetime probability of an African American man of being imprisoned is 1 in 3. For Latino men, it's slightly better. The probability is 1 in 6. For white men, it's 1 in 17. So there seems to be a pretty big disparity. Now, in recent years, this gap has narrowed, but it still exists. So, well, this really raises the question whether there is a disparate application of the law. Are minorities getting harsher sentences? And perhaps the most obvious place to start is with the judges who ultimately determine the length of prison sentences. Now, this is not a new concern. For several decades, Congress has tried to alleviate sentence disparities, and the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 was passed, and by 1987, guidelines were released to provide for determinate sentencing. That's really an important key word. Determinate as in removing uncertainty, and that's what we will talk about a lot today. But let me just give you a sense of how these federal sentencing guidelines are supposed to work. Well, you start off with the offense, with the alleged offense, or rather, when we're talking about this, we're past the point of where a guilty verdict was reached by a jury, or past the point where the defendant pleaded guilty. So this is only about the penalty part, the imprisonment part, not about whether or not to find somebody guilty. So anyway, so you have the offense, and each type of offense has a certain number of points that gives you the base level offense. And then there are specific offense characteristics, such as, did you hurt somebody? Were you a leader in the crime activity that was committed? Did you show remorse? Was a weapon used? So there are a number of points that you can add on or deduct. And that's all detailed, I should say, in great detail in over 600 pages of the federal sentencing guidelines. Once you add it all up, you get to a sentencing range. And what I should point out, to limit the scope of our discussion today, all the sentences we talk about are related to drug trafficking. So because they actually account for a very large portion of all federal crimes. So we're not talking about crimes that are prosecuted at the state level. We're only talking about federal crimes. Here's just a quick snapshot of what the guidelines look like. And this is the right page here that you see on the slide. That's the interesting page, because that's the sentencing table. And so you basically take the number of points you have arrived at after adding and deducting everything. Then you go to the line that corresponds to the offense level. And then in the columns, you see the criminal history category. And depending on how much criminal history you have, you get kind of a higher or a lower sentencing range. And we hear about this very often. First-time offenders get off easy, whereas hardened career criminals, they get sort of the upper end of this range. So now there's still room for judgment, even though these guidelines are specific. So where the arrow points at, for instance, with an offense level of 32 and a criminal history category of 1, there's a range of 121 through 151 months in prison. So there's still some room for judgment for the judge. Now, as you can imagine, these sentencing guidelines reduce judges' discretion. However, that didn't really stay static over time. There were both legislative actions and Supreme Court decisions that affected the judiciary discretion significantly. And perhaps the most talked about ruling in this context was the Booker case, United States v. Booker, in which the Supreme Court reached a conclusion that these federal sentencing guidelines are advisory rather than mandatory. So now, so in a way, there was a bit of a roller coaster in terms of judiciary discretion, because depending on what it was, kind of the discretion was tightened or loosened over time. And so obviously that was, we're not the first ones to look at this or to consider how this has evolved over time. Many researchers and commissions have been studying this. And in fact, Congress has tasked the United States Sentencing Commission to evaluate the impact of the Booker Supreme Court decision. And here I'm just quoting this key sentence from the Booker report from the very first paragraph. And it says, the United States Sentencing Commission submits this report to Congress on the impact of the Booker ruling on federal sentencing in order to assist Congress in its efforts to ensure certain and fair sentencing, and so on. So really the key words here are certain and fair, and these will be our key research questions for today. So you may wonder, okay, how are we dealing with this? These seem to be kind of very common sense topics, almost casual terms. How do we translate those into measurable quantities that we can perhaps estimate with the help of Bayesian networks? Well, we really need to distinguish these two now. First of all, certain, that will be the easier study. We will quantify uncertainty by calculating the entropy of the distributions of sentences. So that will be purely a data-driven task. The second one, will be much more challenging. And this is how we are going to, or how we're trying to get to whether a sentence is fair or not, or whether sentencing in general is fair. We would say fair is the absence of the presence of extra-legal causes in sentencing. So we need to estimate the potential effects of extra-legal causes, and we would hope them to be zero. If not, then extra-legal causes have an influence on sentencing. An extra-legal cause could be race, it could be age, it could be gender, because they really shouldn't influence. Nowhere does the law say that a male and a female should be sentenced to different prison terms. So those variables should not at all play a role. Same thing with race, same thing with age, same thing with sexual orientation, and so on. These would be extra legal. They don't count. Only what's in the law that should count. I'm probably stating the obvious here. So, but now let's put this into context. How are we going to approach this? Here is our map of analytic modeling and reasoning, and many of you will already have seen this. This will serve as our compass. We want to see where these questions belong. Just for reference, on the x-axis on this map, we have model purpose. On the left, association correlation. On the right, causation. On the y-axis, we have model source, for which we have data at the top and theory at the bottom. But once again, we need to be very clear that there's a very important distinction between the left side and the right side, association correlation versus causation. And we need to be very, very careful as we go beyond that limit. That's really a hard stop in many ways. So anyway, let's talk about certainty. And fortunately, this will be very easy to address. We can stay in the upper left-hand quadrant here because all we need is data. And fortunately, there is quite a lot of data from which we can estimate the quantities of interest. However, as we want to talk about fairness, that's where we have to enter the realm of causality. And there we will need a lot more than just data. So this will be the place where theory comes in, where assumptions come in. That's quite important. So why am I talking about this particular problem domain today? Well, I think Bayesian networks are ideally suited to talk about this entire spectrum, because Bayesian networks, on the one hand, can help us cover the upper left-hand quadrant. We can machine learn models from data. On the other hand, we can also encode formal causal assumptions that we will require as we talk about fairness. But first things first, let's start with certain. And I said we need data for this. So what data do we have? Now, fortunately, there is lots of data. The United States Sentencing Commission database contains millions of records of criminal sentences. And as I said earlier, we are only going to look at the subset of sentences that relate to drug trafficking. So what we have available in data, you see all the variables listed here on this slide. And for these observations that were made from 1996 through 2011, we have a total of approximately 319,000 observations. That will be the data that we're going to work with for the rest of this webinar. So, certain. Well, what is certainty? In our daily conversation, we know what certain means, but what is the sort of the mathematical definition? For that, we need to take a quick detour into information theory. And let me start off with a quote by Claude Shannon, who is really the inventor of the field of information theory. He says, information is the resolution of uncertainty. So how can we quantify that now? Well, let's formally introduce entropy as a measure of uncertainty. And I want to illustrate this with the distribution of citizens versus non-citizens in the USSC data set that we're going to work with. So we have roughly 300,000 individuals in this database, and the distribution is that 70% are US citizens, 30% are not. And this includes legal and illegal immigrants both. So, this means if you were to walk into a prison, the first person you meet would have a 70% probability of being a US citizen. So we can now quantify that degree of certainty or uncertainty by computing the entropy. with this famous formula minus p log p, and the quantity you see in the green box. So this 70-30 probability, that distribution, that translates into an entropy of 0.877. Now, what does that mean? Well, it only is meaningful if we compare it to the maximum entropy, which is if we had a 50-50 probability. If we have had a uniform distribution of citizens and non-citizens, then we would have perfect uncertainty with regard to this variable, and the entropy would be 1. Conversely, if we only had non-citizens, then the entropy with regard to this variable would be 0. All uncertainty would be removed. Or actually, I said if we only had US citizens. Yeah, but the same would apply if we only had non-US citizens. There would be no uncertainty. Okay, this is trivial, but it's important to know. Now, how can we utilize this? Let me take the next step here. Let's now look at conditional entropy, the entropy of citizenship given race. Now, here I'm introducing another variable, a variable here in the form of a little bar chart that refers to race, where we have the racial breakdown of the prison population. And what we now want to do is, if knowing race helps us reduce our uncertainty with regard to citizenship. And we can easily try this out. Here I'm just showing a screenshot from BayesiaLab, where, for instance, if we were to encounter a white person in a prison, then the probability of this person being a US citizen would be 92%. So we can compute the corresponding entropy. So that would be 0.3857 and so on. Now, if the individual were black, then the probability of being a US citizen would be even higher. We would be at 93%, and the entropy would be lower. However, if we looked at a Hispanic individual, the entropy would be much higher, since then we would have a 59-41 distribution, which brings the entropy very close to 1. And finally, we also have the other category, which gives us an entropy of 0.82. So now, if we take the weighted average of the conditional entropies, that gives us the overall conditional entropies of citizenship given race. And we can see, if we know race, then our uncertainty regarding citizenship is significantly lower. And having the marginal entropy and the conditional entropy allows us to compute a quantity that is known as mutual information. So with the marginal entropy of citizenship, conditional entropy of citizenship given race, and with that, we can formally compute mutual information. So that seems like a very cumbersome approach. BayesiaLab does that automatically for you. So whenever you learn a network and have an arc between nodes, you can ask BayesiaLab to show what that quantity is. So here in this case, between race and citizenship, that the amount of information is 0.2346, which translates into a relative mutual information, or rather, with the other way we can represent this is, given that we know race, our uncertainty with regard to citizenship is reduced by 23.46%. That's the second number in the box, as is reported by BayesiaLab. One thing that I should mention, mutual information is a symmetrical metric. So this information is the same both ways. So why do we need this? Why is this interesting for our purposes? Well, we now want to look at entropy over time, but not of race or citizenship. That's not of our principal interest here. Rather, we want to look at the distribution of sentence versus guideline range. That is one specific variable in our data set. So for each record, we know was the sentence, the prison sentence, above the range, within the range, below the range, or was it below the range with the government having sponsored that lower sentence? I mean, that would be if you, for instance, get your sentence lowered in exchange for testimony. In those courtroom dramas, we often see those things. Very interesting, can be presented very dramatically. But that is an important element here. Okay, but our interest is now, how has that changed over time? You know, how have these decisions, how have the laws affected this distribution? And we want to quantify that. So let me now leave PowerPoint and switch to BayesiaLab. Just bear with me as I'm making the switch. It always takes a few moments. Let's now take a look at two variables that represent the quantities of interest. The first one that I'm highlighting now with my mouse cursor, that is the variable called Booker2. That's the official variable name in the database. That captures sentence versus guideline range. That is the distribution we are interested in. And then the second variable is fiscal year. So let's now establish a relationship between these two variables by drawing an arc and estimating the parameters. So I'm now just taking 2 out of the 30 or so variables that we have and just look at that subset of variables. I will go into the validation mode and bring these up. Let me make this larger. Okay, so here you see our two variables, and I will now, just for illustration purposes, quickly click through the states. For instance, let's look at what is going on in the year 2002. So I set evidence on the year 2002, and now we see the distribution of below range, within range, above range. And now I will go to 2003. This is after the new Protect Act was passed and enacted. And you can see now that there's a significant change in distribution between the two. I'm toggling back and forth. And you can see really that the below range part has dropped significantly. And then I can keep going. Here in 2004, it goes down even further, and so on. Then in 2005, it goes up again. That's when the Booker sentence comes in, and so on. So I can kind of click my way through and then perhaps record the distributions, or I can at any time look at the entropy by clicking the I key and hovering over the monitor. Then BayesiaLab reports to me what the quantity is. But when you have a large number of values, then it would be kind of tedious to do. So I'm going to show you how we can do this in a much easier way utilizing function nodes. I've already put a function node here on the graph panel. By default, the name is F1, and I'm now drawing an arc from Booker2 to F1. So, and in the function node, I can now do quite a number of things, such as I can do any computations, almost like an Excel field where I can enter all kinds of formulas. What I want to use here is the inference function for entropy. So I'm just selecting it from the list of functions. It pops up into my equation field, and then I'm selecting from the center panel at the bottom my variable Booker2. After all, I connected that node to the function node. So I've entered that here, and then there's furthermore an optional field which allows me to compute the normalized entropy. This is very helpful because then I get an entropy range between 0 and 1 as opposed to having the entropy on an undefined scale. So we will do that here. Okay, done. I'll just learn the parameters again. And then we can see how, hold on. I will actually bring up the function node as well. So now we have that on top. And as I'm going through my individual years, you can see how the function node now shows me the normalized entropy value. Okay, very straightforward, but let me take this a step further. Let me just also give this a more meaningful name. I call it entropy normalized of Booker 2. All right, well, one function I particularly like in BayesiaLab is the target mean analysis, which allows us to plot response curves as a function of variables. However, I can't make a function node a target node. Rather, I'm creating a kind of a substitute node, and I'll just call that entropy. It's an unobserved node that serves the only purpose. It's kind of a copy, a clone of the function node, but that clone I can make a target node. The only thing I need to define here is the equation, and the equation here in this particular case is very, very simple because my new node is simply a copy, is simply the equal value of the function node. So, and another little idiosyncrasy in BayesiaLab we need to deal with to make it part of the network. I need to formally introduce this cloned node into the network by drawing an extra arc. Did I just do this correctly? Validate. Okay, here we go. So now we're in a position to run our target mean analysis, which of course we can only run in the validation mode. Okay, and here is my response curve. And this is now really interesting because now we have a measure for uncertainty or certainty as a function of time. Now we can see how different time periods appear to affect the certainty in sentencing. So after the first period is known as the Kuhn period. You saw that in the earlier slide, which kind of relaxed somewhat the judiciary discretion. So you can see 96, 97, 98, all the way up to 2002, you have an increasing discretion, increasing uncertainty. Then you have the Protect Act that really clamps down. And that Protect Act is then relieved by first by the Booker ruling, which brings it back up, and then finally also by the Gall ruling. We won't be going into further details, but I think this is really interesting, and I think this is really the first time anybody has tried to quantify that uncertainty that everybody keeps talking about. So in a sense, that is a bit of an innovation that we're sharing here, and I hope this will be used in research practice in the future. So, and what I should say is you have screenshots of all of this in the slides that you can download. So let's go back. Let's now go to our other question, and I need to change my applications again. Hold on, no, wrong thing. This one I wanted to share. Okay, here we go. Back in business. So Let's now go to our second research objective, and that is, are sentences fair? Now, for the first objective, we could simply compute this from data. That was very, very straightforward. But what about the second part? So now we need to enter into the realm of causality. We need a causal model, which means we really can't just use more data. We may always be tempted to say, well, can we use some clever statistical technique, or can we use more data? No, we can't. So, but you may ask, well, why do we need a causal model in the first place? I've just kind of stated that up front. Well, let me illustrate why a causal model, or why this is a causal question. Well, think about it. I have a random causal model here where I have guideline, weapon enhancement, criminal history, and race shown as potential causes of the total prison sentence. And I think you will agree with me that if this were the correct model, if this were faithfully representing our underlying domain, then we should be able to detect, to estimate effects from the top three, because that's reasonable. Those are the things that are defined by law that should influence the prison sentence, as opposed to race, which must not be a cause of sentence. But for this is really a causal question that we need to deal with. This is very, very important to bear in mind. So you would think that the Booker report, this is the document I referenced earlier. Hold on. Sorry, I just had a pop-up message appearing here on my screen, which threw me off momentarily. My computer started installing something on its own, which I had to stop. So the Booker report, this enormously large study that looked at fairness and certainty in sentencing in over 1,400 pages, they only mentioned causality once in the footnote, in one single footnote. So, and I think that's a bit disconcerting, considering that that fairness is very much a causal question. So how do they address it? How do they try to get to fairness? Well, they talk about multivariate analysis and controlling. Honestly, they're trying to get to the same objective, but they don't actually say that. They say we control for this, we control for that, for these factors. They use very elaborate statistical language, talk about conditioning, stratifying, matching, adjusting, and they show many models in which different permutations of these techniques are utilized, and they report results. But they never really admit that what they're after is a causal result. They just use this very, very vague language, implying that it is causal without saying it. So here in this context, I want to quote Judea Pearl, who makes it very, very clear, and I think this quote says a lot. The prevailing attitude is that adding more covariates can cause no harm and can absolve one from thinking about causal relationships. So statistical tricks, conditioning, all these things may be potentially right, but you can't just apply them and hoping for the best by doing more of them, by conditioning and controlling more. You really need to think about causality in the first place. That is what is important. And that drives what you should control. You don't just control hoping that more controlling is better. So what we need to do is we need to address causality very explicitly. And this is not easy, and it is certainly not without risk. So no wonder people are shying away from crossing that bridge. So how do we go about it? How do we how do we get to our causal model? Well, we need theory. That's our fancy word for our assumptions. With theory, I should say, we can create a causal model. And if we have that formally defined, we can compute causal inference. So how do we go about that in practice? Now, all this has been very theoretical, conceptual so far. Well, I should perhaps just say real quick that with all this talking about causal inference and assumptions, it would still be best if we could just run an experiment. You know, that's the true gold standard for getting to a causal effect. But clearly, you can't do experiments on people in the justice system. So all we have is observational data, and from non-experimental observational data, we can't directly establish causality. So we need to introduce our theory, and there are two ways how we can do that. Two approaches, and I'll showcase a little bit of the first. That's the blue part here, and then the gray part is the one that we'll carry through all the way to the end. So the first one is we take all our variables that we have and make assumptions about their relationships, how they all connect, and so on. So let's try to do that. Here are all our variables, and let's then think about, well, what causes what? If we were to consider the prison sentence as the target node. The question is, what causes prison sentence? And perhaps you would say, well, everything could be a potential cause of prison sentence. You know, the drug type, the district court, weapons enhancement, all these things could be causes. Yeah, but that's not enough. We need to also think about, well, how do the variables relate to each other? For instance, is race a cause of what drugs the crime could be about? You know, the drug type, well, that's perhaps a cause of the guideline, how the guideline is applied. So there are many possible causal paths that we have to consider, and we get into the hundreds and thousands of and millions of possible relationships. There are way too many assumptions for us to make, so that really becomes a dead end. So what do we do instead? Well, we're taking a different approach, a new approach. What we're doing is we're first machine learning a Bayesian network. That's the bottom here, the gray path. We machine learn a Bayesian network and then use something very, very clever. Or let me back up rather. When we talk about machine learning a Bayesian network, that means that network that we have learned is a non-causal network, as opposed to the blue one, the expert-defined causal network. That represents a causal model. If we machine learn a Bayesian network, that can only be non-causal. So how can we deal with that? Well, here we're going to introduce the theory later. We are first learning a non-causal network and then entering the theory using the disjunctive cause criterion. And this is something really clever, something very innovative that has only been discovered fairly recently. It makes it much, much simpler to encode our assumptions, or rather we need to make a lot fewer assumptions. The criterion with this very elaborate name actually is very, very short. It's one sentence really. It says, we propose that control be made for any pre-treatment covariate that is either a cause of treatment or of the outcome or both. So in our case, our potential cause is race, so we need to consider that as the treatment, as odd as it sounds. Outcome is the sentence. And the pre-treatment covariate that we need to identify, we declare them confounders in BayesiaLab. So what we need to do now is we need to look at all the variables and say confounder, non-confounder, just go through them, apply this question, are they cause of the treatment, the outcome, or both? And if any of this is yes, we make those variables confounders, otherwise they're non-confounders. And that is so much easier. There are so many fewer assumptions we need to make here. And in BayesiaLab, this is now very convenient to utilize, because once we've made these assignments, then we can run a direct effects analysis. Then we can very easily compute the causal effect. So that's what we're going to do now. But this is very important, and I will get back to that probably several times. We need to realize that that this only holds if there are no unobserved confounders, so that there are no external causes that we have not in our model. That's a very bold assumption, and as we will later discuss, that assumption can probably not be justified here. But for now, we will assume we have everything in, and we have all the relevant variables, and based on that, we're going to now build a model. So I will leave PowerPoint again and switch to BayesiaLab. Let me just see whether this works. Okay, here's still our chart from before. I will close out of this. We don't need this now. And now just go straight to our data set, to the USSC database. I'll open the data source. I open the file. And here I see a preview, a table style preview of my entire data set of 320,000 observations or so. BayesiaLab looks at this and guesses what type of variables we have. And in most cases, it gets it right. Here, I need to overrule it, no pun intended. Circuit district and the circuit, those variables, I want to treat these indicators for the district court and the circuit court, I need to make discrete. Furthermore, I will also consider fiscal year as a discrete variable. So I don't want that to be discretized by BayesiaLab. As opposed to the other variables, those need to be discretized. The other continuous variables. The red ones, they are already discrete. Next. Okay, here we deal with missing values processing. Luckily, this is a very, very complete data set. So, and in this subset that we have, there are no missing values whatsoever. Next. So what this we need to do, we need to discretize our continuous variables. And given that we have variables such as sentence length, I want to use a discretization that in multiples of 12 months, so it's a little bit easier to interpret. So I'm not going to use BayesiaLab's automatic discretization. Rather, I'm going to load a discretization that I had previously prepared that cuts the sentence length into nice reasonable chunks in multiples of 12 months. Okay, let me finish this now. Now this is a fairly large database, so it will probably take 20 seconds or so to load. BayesiaLab now needs to create this internal representation of this database, the data that is loaded. And normally part of this process is also the discretization, where BayesiaLab would be searching for an optimal binning. Here I've predefined the binning in an external file, in a little text file that has just given me where I have specified the bins. Okay, here we are. Let me zoom in. Here are all the variables. One thing I will add is a dictionary file because these names are a little bit cryptic, these original variable names. So I will add a file, node comments, in which I have linked the original short variable names to more complete descriptive names. And one more thing I will do is I'll change the layout to a staggered layout so we can more easily read these labels so they don't overlap. So here are all the variables. And yeah, I think at this point we're ready to go to machine learning. So what we now want to do is machine learn a Bayesian network model with the sentence length as the target node. That's this one here. And I will formally declare that as the target node, and then ask BayesiaLab to learn a supervised model. Let me do that now. Supervised learning, and of all the possible models, I'm choosing the tree augmented naive. I've played with this particular data set earlier this year, and this seems to be a pretty good approach. So let me run with that. Oh, I forget something. I wanted to set aside, create a learning test set split. So we actually have the ability to test whether the model that we have learned is actually good. So I've now asked BayesiaLab to set aside 20% of those 300,000 observations. Okay, now let's learn tree augmented naive Bayes. Okay, here we are, we're done. We've learned the model, and perhaps before we go any further, let's test this and see how good this model is. Is it really useful? I've switched into the validation mode and now run the target performance analysis. Shouldn't take very long at all. And the report should be popping up momentarily. Here it is. So, and there are lots of measures that you can now see on this report. My eye is always drawn towards the confusion matrix. And even at the first glance, I can immediately see that the diagonal has the most value. So it looks like, just qualitatively looking at it, that the model seems to be reasonable. I have gains curve, lift curve, ROC curve, calibration curve. I can look at this for different sentence lengths. But perhaps the most easily interpretable value is r squared, which makes sense here. We have an r squared of 0.87. So that's perhaps gives us a sense that this may be a reasonable model. Now, we could probably spend quite a bit of time further optimizing this model. I will leave it as is and rather proceed towards interpretation. Or rather, there are a couple of things I want to do. And in fact, I'm doing a few more things that are related purely to the informational aspects of the model before we go into the causal question. So all this, what we're seeing now, is still just a statistical model. We can't say anything about causality yet. So let me change the layout here. And a good way to get to a very nice layout is first to turn on the mutual information for the arcs, and then to do a radial layout, because in this case, our nodes are sorted clockwise according to their mutual information. Now here, this isn't particularly visible, but if we go into the mapping function, where we here mapping to the mapping, we can very nicely showcase kind of the order of importance in terms of the information content. And I think this is a somewhat encouraging piece of information. Now here, the size of the nodes represents the amount of mutual information that each node has with regard to the target node. Remember mutual information, we talked about it earlier, how we can arrive at it, how it is computed. Here, the amount of mutual information is represented in the node size. This tells us that the guidelines actually are most informative with regard to the prison sentence. Well, that's kind of what we would have expected. The next one here in pink is primary drug type. Perhaps that makes sense too. This is perhaps less clear, circuit district, and so on. Now, luckily, race is pretty far behind in terms of importance, and perhaps that is an encouraging sign too. But this is just for our education. We're not interpreting this in a causal sense in any way. Okay. That's what we want to do now. We want to go into causality, but I kind of keep pushing it off. Let me first look at this non-causally. Kind of what I want to show you what gave rise to this perception of disparity. So I'm taking this model, this predictive model, and perform observational inference. At the top here, we have total prison sentence. That's the final prison sentence ordered. I mean, this is the time people spend in prison. And at the bottom, we have race. I will set this distribution as the reference distribution. This distribution has an expected value of 77 months. So of all people who go to prison, this seems to be the average length that they are sentenced to. Let's now go through race. I set observation on black, and you see the expected value jumps up by 31 months. So that's a significant change. You can immediately see it in the appearance here of the distribution. I go to Hispanic. That is below average, minus 13 months. Other is minus 12, and white is minus 11. So that's kind of what gave rise to our concern, the disparity that we saw earlier on. So, but what we should also realize, if I now bring in a second variable, where is drug type primary, here this refers to the drug type. If I now repeat this, black, you see here the primary drug type that gave rise to the sentence is crack. For Hispanics, it's marijuana. For whites, it's methamphetamines. So apparently there are dynamics that presumably have an influence on the sentence. But it makes no sense to just look at things one by one. Rather, what we need to do now is to look at what variables here are confounders versus non-confounders, what we must control for or not control for. Actually, let me do one thing and now remove the learning test set. That actually we don't need any longer. Let me just relearn the model real quick without that, so we can take full advantage of all the observations we have now that we've demonstrated this learning algorithm is actually good. So what we now need to do is basically go around the circle here and look at which ones of these we should consider as confounders and non-confounders. And that's not super easy, because we now really need to think, is a variable pre-existing, or is it perhaps directly related to the prison sentence, or comes perhaps after the prison sentence, and so on. So we don't have time to really discuss this in detail and review variables one-on-one, and I kind of half expected that I would be running out of time. So I have prepared my assumptions for these variables, and I'm importing a dictionary that in which I have recorded what variable I want to declare as confounder and as non-confounders. So I'll just show you which ones these are, and I'm by no means sure that that is a complete list. The ones that are highlighted here, I have declared those as non-confounders, and so we will not be, as we now look at effects, we will not be conditioning on those. We will not be controlling for those. So there are now a number of ways how we can estimate the effects. I will do it kind of the very slow and explicit way. First, hold on, let me do this here. I'm sorry, as soon as a menu goes outside the window of outside the BayesiaLab window, then I think GoToWebinar resizes the screen and everything may bounce around on your screen. I'm now selecting the classes confounders. I invert my selection and bring up all my confounders here in this window. And with that, now that I've highlighted all confounders, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm selecting all of them and I set fixed probabilities. So with that, I'm now conditioning on all the confounders. I'm controlling for all the confounders. And now I can, actually let me remove those now so we have a nice and clear screen. If I now continue and go through what we did before, I'm now toggling through the different races. Well, let's see how the distribution changes now that we're controlling for confounders. So we can interpret what we now see as the causal effect. So, well, let's see. Let me double click on this distribution is still the reference distribution. Now I click on black, and this suggests that the causal effect of being black, as opposed to having no racial, as opposed to have an average distribution, is plus 1.5. So earlier we had, I forgot what it was a much, much larger number. So given black, plus 1.5, Hispanic, 0.6 months, other, minus 2.2, and white, minus 4.7. So we still have, there still seems to be some effect, but certainly it is much, much smaller than what observational inference would have suggested. Now, and that's what I mentioned in the caveat earlier. Perhaps you may say, oh, okay, so everything is fine. This seems to be a minor discrepancy. Perhaps we don't need to worry about this. But all this only holds if my confounder selection is correct and that there are no unobserved confounders. That is very, very important to bear in mind. And I think especially the second assumption cannot hold, because there are a lot of things that happen before sentencing takes place. Think about what the prosecutor negotiates with the lawyer of the defendant and plea bargaining and so on. And okay, you plead to this and testify on that, and I will reduce 2 points here and add some mitigating factors. So all that pre-negotiation that obviously has an influence on the total prison sentence, we have not captured here. So within these variables that we have, the potential bias seems to be much smaller than what we had anticipated. But we don't know all the other things that happened before then that are causes of many of these variables. And so therefore I'm saying we cannot take a conclusion from that. Rather, what I wanted to share is that we have the methodology here. if we now had the ability to take into account many more variables about the prosecution and everything that happened earlier, then this approach would give us a way to get to causal inference. And that was the objective of today's webinar. So let me switch back into PowerPoint. Okay, yes. So you have screenshots of everything that I have showed you in the live software demo. So let me give you a quick outlook of what's ahead in our event program. In 2 weeks' time, we have a webinar about geographic optimization. We will now be hosting these webinars on a bi-weekly basis. June 1st, we don't have the topic yet. Still working on it. Encourage you to send us any topic suggestions, any ideas you have for an interesting topic that we could discuss at a webinar. June 19th, we have a seminar in Chicago that will be an event in the loop, an afternoon-long seminar. This will be about knowledge discovery from financial data. Should be a very interesting topic. And also bear in mind, we have courses around the world that we host very regularly. The next one that's coming up is going to be in Seattle, less than 2 weeks from now. And in Seattle, we'll be hosting an introductory as well as an advanced course. So for those of you who have already participated in the intro course, this is a great opportunity to join the advanced course. Then Boston, San Francisco, London, Delhi, Chicago, New York will be all over the place. And for those of you who don't have a BayesiaLab license yet, you can download a demo or apply for the unrestricted evaluation version, download the data that I shared with you today. It's all publicly available, and you can replicate the analysis steps that I've taken. And for questions, suggestions, please go on to our user forum, Bezier.com community. We encourage you to have discussions and debate around what we've done today. And please mark your calendars. Our annual conference this year is going to be in Chicago, November 1st and 2nd. We have a fantastic location right off Michigan Avenue, next door to the John Hancock Tower. Chicago is a fantastic city. We have people coming together from all over the world to present at our conference. So I'm confident it is going to be a great event. So I apologize for running over. I really didn't time this right today, but I appreciate you hanging in there. Thank you so much for your time and interest. Here are my contact details. Please stay in touch. We'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks again. Hope to see you in 2 weeks' time, and have a great weekend.